The dust devil that kicked up on Highway 287 that scorching July morning seemed like any other phenomenon in the endless stretch of New Mexico desert. But what emerged from that swirling cloud of sand and heat would change everything for Jake Martinez, though he didn't know it yet. Standing on the weathered deck of his adobe ranch house, squinting through the glare, Jake watched as a battered station wagon limped toward his property like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Nobody ever came down this road by accident. His ranch sat 23 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge, connected only by a dirt road that most folks avoided unless they were lost or desperate. Jake preferred it that way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After 15 years of solitude, visitors felt about as welcome as rattlesnakes in his living room. The engine coughed and wheezed before dying completely about 50 yards from his front gate. Steam rose from the hood like morning mist, and Jake could hear the distinct sound of metal cooling in the desert heat. He pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes and waited, arms crossed, wondering what kind of trouble had just broken down on his doorstep. The driver's door opened with a creak that carried across the stillness, and out stepped a woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her simple blue dress looked like it had seen better days. But it was what happened next that made Jake's jaw drop. 3 identical little heads popped up from the back seat, followed by 3 pairs of curious brown eyes scanning their surroundings. Triplets, Jake realized, each one appearing to be about 4 years old. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the woman opened the rear door, out bounded what Jake initially thought was a medium-sized dog with floppy ears and an enthusiastic tail wag. Except it wasn't a dog at all. It was a goat. A brown and white spotted goat that immediately began behaving exactly like an oversized golden retriever, complete with tongue hanging out and tail wagging furiously as it sniffed around the desert scrub. The woman surveyed the breakdown with the kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of someone accustomed to setbacks. She knelt beside the steaming engine, one hand shading her eyes from the brutal sun, while the triplets climbed out of the car with the determined efficiency of seasoned travelers. Each child carried a small backpack, and they moved with the kind of synchronized precision that only comes from being born together and growing up as a unit. The goat, meanwhile, had discovered Jake's water trough and was drinking with the enthusiasm of a creature that understood the value of finding water in the desert. Its tail continued wagging the entire time, and when it finished drinking, it sat down exactly like a dog would, tongue still hanging out, looking perfectly content with its surroundings. Jake remained on his deck, torn between curiosity and irritation. He'd moved to this isolated ranch specifically to avoid situations like this one. People brought complications, and complications brought pain. Better to stay uninvolved, let them figure out their own problems, and send them on their way as quickly as possible. But as he watched the small family assess their situation, something tugged at a corner of his heart that he'd thought was permanently sealed off. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly as she popped the hood and stared at what was undoubtedly a terminal engine problem. The triplets huddled together in the shade of the car, sharing water from a single bottle with the careful rationing of children who understood scarcity. One of the children, a boy with sandy hair that stuck up despite obvious attempts to tame it, noticed Jake watching from the deck. He nudged his sisters, and soon all 3 were staring at the weathered cowboy with the kind of frank curiosity that only children possess. The boy raised his hand in a tentative wave. Jake found himself lifting his own hand in response before he could stop himself. The simple gesture seemed to break some invisible barrier, because the woman looked up from the engine and spotted him for the first time. She straightened, wiped her hands on her dress, and began walking toward his gate with the determined stride of someone who'd made a decision. The triplets fell into step behind her, and the goat brought up the rear, tail still wagging as it trotted along like the family dog it believed itself to be. The procession was so unusual that Jake found himself fighting back an unexpected smile. "Excuse me," the woman called when she reached the gate. Her voice carried clearly across the dry air, tinged with a slight southern accent that spoke of origins far from this desert landscape. "I'm sorry to bother you, but our car's broken down, and I was wondering if you might have a phone I could use to call for help." Jake studied her face from his elevated position on the deck. She was prettier than he'd initially realized. with intelligent green eyes and the kind of natural beauty that didn't need enhancement. But it was the way she held herself that caught his attention. Despite the obvious stress of her situation, she stood straight and proud, chin lifted in a gesture of dignity that reminded him of someone from long ago. "Nearest mechanics in Cedar Ridge," he called back, making no move to come closer. "Won't be cheap to get a tow truck out here. And from the looks of that steam, you're probably looking at more than a simple fix." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly at this news, but she nodded with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd been dealing with bad news for a while. "I understand. If you could just let me make the call, I'd be grateful. We can wait by the road for the tow truck." It was the boy who spoke up then, his young voice carrying clearly in the desert stillness. "Mama, it's really hot out here. Can't we wait in the shade somewhere?" Jake looked at the child, then at his two sisters, who were standing close together with the kind of protective instinct that twins and triplets often develop. They were clearly tired, hot, and probably hungry. The goat had found a patch of sparse grass and was grazing contentedly, occasionally looking up to check on its human family with the devoted attention of a loyal pet. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself walking down from the deck toward the gate. Each step felt like a betrayal of the solitary life he'd carefully constructed, but something about the sight of those three small children wilting in the desert heat overrode his usual caution. "Name's Jake Martinez," he said when he reached the gate, though he made no move to open it. "This is my ranch." "I'm Elena Vasquez," the woman replied, and Jake caught the slight hesitation before she gave her last name, as if she'd had to think about it. "These are my children, Miguel, Sophia, and Carmen. And this," she gestured to the goat, which had wandered over to investigate Jake through the fence, "is Pancho." As if responding to his name, Pancho pressed his nose against the fence slats and wagged his tail even more enthusiastically. The gesture was so dog-like that Jake found himself staring in fascination. "He thinks he's a dog," Miguel explained matter-of-factly. "He's been that way since we got him. Mama says it's because he was raised with dogs when he was little." "Is that so?" Jake found himself addressing the boy directly, surprised by how easily the words came. He hadn't talked to children in years. "And where did you folks come from?" Elena's hand tightened protectively on Miguel's shoulder. "We've been traveling for a while, looking for a fresh start." The vague answer told Jake that there was a story there, probably not a happy one. "Papa went away," Sophia volunteered, earning a sharp look from her mother. "Mama says we're going to find somewhere better to live." The simple statement carried more weight than the 4-year-old probably realized. Jake caught the flash of pain that crossed Elena's face before she composed herself, and he recognized the look of someone carrying burdens too heavy for her small shoulders. "Well," Jake said slowly, still fighting against every instinct that told him to stay uninvolved, "you can use my phone to call for that tow truck. But you should know, it'll probably be several hours before anyone can get out here, and the sun's only going to get hotter." Elena nodded gratefully. "We'll manage. We've gotten used to managing." There was something in the way she said it that tugged at Jake's conscience. These weren't tourists who'd taken a wrong turn. This was a woman with 3 small children and a goat, traveling in a car that was clearly on its last legs, carrying everything they owned and heading toward an uncertain future. Jake stared at the small family for a long moment, wrestling with himself. The smart thing would be to let them use the phone, maybe offer some water, and send them on their way. That was what the old Jake, the Jake from before, would have done without hesitation. But looking at those 3 tired children and their determined mother, something shifted inside him. Maybe it was the way Pancho was looking at him through the fence with those trusting brown eyes, tail still wagging hopefully. Maybe it was the way the triplets stood close together, instinctively protecting each other. Or maybe it was the sight of Elena trying so hard to appear strong when she was clearly at the end of a rope. "Look," he heard himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "It's going to be brutal out here in a few hours. Sun's barely getting started. You can wait inside where it's cool while we figure out what to do about your car." Elena's eyes widened with surprise and relief. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Martinez, but we don't want to impose. We're strangers, and you don't know anything about us." "I know you've got 3 kids who need to get out of this heat," Jake replied, reaching for the gate latch. And I know that goat of yours is going to keel over if he stays in this sun much longer, no matter how much he thinks he's a dog." As if to prove Jake's point, Pancho had found a small patch of shade cast by the fence post and was panting heavily, his tail finally still for the first time since Jake had seen him. Jake opened the gate and stepped back, gesturing for them to enter. "House is up there. Got water, food, and air conditioning." "Phone's on the kitchen counter." Elena hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded with the decisive movement of someone who'd learned to accept help when it was offered. "Thank you. We won't stay long, just until the tow truck comes." The triplets needed no further encouragement. They filed through the gate with the organized efficiency Jake was beginning to recognize as their trademark, each one pausing to thank him politely as they passed. Pancho bounded through last, immediately beginning to explore his new surroundings with renewed enthusiasm, nose to the ground and tail back to its constant wagging. As they walked toward the house, Jake found himself studying his unexpected guests more closely. The children were clearly well-behaved and polite, despite their obvious fatigue. Their clothes were clean, but showed the wear of being packed and unpacked many times. Each child carried their belongings in a small backpack that looked like it contained everything they owned in the world. Elena walked slightly behind her children, keeping them in sight, while maintaining a respectful distance from Jake. He could sense her wariness, the careful way she assessed her surroundings and kept track of exits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was the behavior of someone who'd learned not to trust too easily, and Jake found himself wondering what had put that watchful look in her eyes. The ranch house sat on a slight rise, giving it a commanding view of the surrounding desert. Jake had built it himself over the course of several years, using traditional adobe techniques that kept it cool in summer and warm in winter. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and comfortable, designed for a man who valued function over form. As they climbed the wooden steps to the front door, Pancho suddenly bounded ahead and sat down in front of the entrance, tail wagging as he looked expectantly at Jake. The gesture was so perfectly dog-like that Jake found himself chuckling despite his usual reserve. "He wants permission to go inside," Carmen explained, speaking for the first time since Jake had met them. Her voice was softer than her siblings, and she had the kind of observant eyes that seemed to take in everything. "He's very polite for a goat." "Is he house-trained?" Jake asked, and immediately felt foolish for the question. "Oh, yes," Miguel said seriously. "He uses the bathroom outside just like a real dog. And he doesn't chew on furniture or anything." Jake shook his head in amazement and opened the front door. The blast of cool air that greeted them was like a physical relief, and he saw Elena's shoulders relax slightly as they stepped into the blessed coolness of the air-conditioned house. The interior of the ranch house reflected its owner's practical nature. The main room was spacious and comfortable, with sturdy leather furniture and walls decorated with a few carefully chosen pieces of southwestern art. Everything was clean and orderly, but it had the unmistakable feel of a space occupied by someone who lived alone. Pancho trotted into the house and immediately made himself at home, settling down on the cool tile floor with a contented sigh. The triplets stood close together near the door, taking in their surroundings with a kind of quiet assessment that spoke of children who'd learned to adapt quickly to new situations. "Phone's right there," Jake said, pointing to the kitchen counter. "Feel free to help yourselves to water. There's juice in the refrigerator if the kids want some." Elena moved toward the phone with visible relief, but before she could dial, Jake found himself speaking again. "Mind if I ask where you were headed?" She paused, her hand on the phone. "We were trying to get to Colorado. I heard there might be work there. Maybe a chance to start over." "Long way to Colorado," Jake observed. "Especially in a car that old." Elena's chin lifted slightly, and Jake caught a flash of pride mixed with desperation. "We've made it this far." The simple statement carried a world of determination, and Jake found himself respecting this woman he'd known for less than an hour. Whatever had brought her to this point, she wasn't giving up. She was fighting for her children and their future with everything she had. While Elena made her call, Jake watched the triplets explore his living room with careful, respectful curiosity. They stayed together, communicating in the kind of shorthand that only close siblings understand, occasionally whispering observations to each other in Spanish. Sophia approached a bookshelf and stood on her tiptoes to see the titles on the higher shelves. Miguel gravitated toward the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of desert with the kind of wonder that spoke of a child who'd spent most of his life in more crowded places. Carmen, meanwhile, had settled down next to Pancho on the floor and was stroking his ears with the gentle touch of someone who understood animals. "The goat really does think he's a dog," Jake observed, settling into his usual chair and finding it strange to have company in his solitary space. "Mama rescued him when he was just a baby," Carmen explained, her voice soft but clear. "The people who had him before kept him with their dogs, so he learned to act like them. He doesn't know he's different." There was something poignant about the idea of a creature so convinced of its identity that it never questioned whether it belonged. Jake found himself looking at Pancho with new understanding, recognizing a kindred spirit in the animal's complete comfort with being exactly who he believed himself to be. Elena finished her phone call and returned to the living room, her expression carefully neutral but with worry lines creasing her forehead. "The tow truck driver says it'll be at least 4 hours before he can get out here. The part of town where his shop is located flooded last night from a storm, and he's dealing with several other emergencies." Jake wasn't surprised. July was monsoon season in New Mexico, and flash floods could turn a normal day into chaos with little warning. "Did he give you an estimate on what it might cost to fix your car?" Elena's hesitation told him everything he needed to know. "He said he'd have to look at it first, but based on my description, it sounds like the engine might be beyond repair." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake could see Elena calculating in her head, trying to figure out how to get herself and 3 children to Colorado without a car, and probably without much money. The math clearly wasn't working in her favor. Miguel had been listening to the adult conversation with the kind of intense attention that children develop when they realize their security depends on understanding the grown-up world. "Mama," he said quietly, "does this mean we can't go to Colorado?" Elena knelt down to her son's level, her voice gentle but honest. "It means we might have to change our plans, Mijo. But we'll figure something out. We always do." The quiet courage in her voice struck Jake like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd already lost so much, facing another devastating setback, and still finding the strength to reassure her children that everything would work out. He recognized the kind of strength it took to keep going when everything seemed to be falling apart, because he'd been there himself once. "Look," Jake said suddenly, the words coming out before he could analyze them. "Why don't you folks plan on staying here tonight? It's going to be dark by the time that tow truck gets here, and there's no point in you sitting by the side of the road in this heat all day." Elena looked up sharply, surprise and gratitude warring in her expression. "Mr. Martinez, that's incredibly generous, but we've already imposed enough. We can wait in town once the tow truck comes." "Town's 23 miles away," Jake pointed out. "And from what I know about Joe's garage, he's not going to have good news about your engine. You might need some time to figure out your next move." He could see Elena weighing her options, pride battling against practical necessity. The triplets were watching the exchange with the kind of hopeful attention that suggested they'd very much like to stay in the cool, comfortable house rather than spend the day wilting in the desert heat. "We don't have much money," Elena said quietly, the admission clearly costing her. "I can't pay you for room and board." Jake waved dismissively. "Wasn't asking for payment. Got plenty of space, and it's been a while since I've had company." The truth was, it had been exactly 5 years, 3 months, and 12 days since he'd had anyone stay in his house overnight. Not that he was counting or anything. The isolation had been intentional, a necessary part of healing from wounds that had seemed too deep to ever mend. But looking at this small family, he found himself remembering what it felt like to care about other people's welfare. Pancho chose that moment to demonstrate his dog-like nature by padding over to Jake's chair and resting his chin on the armrest, looking up with soulful brown eyes. The gesture was so perfectly timed and so thoroughly endearing that Jake found himself reaching down to scratch the goat's ears. "He likes you," Sophia observed with the kind of certainty that only children possess. "Pancho's a good judge of character. Mama says animals can tell when people have good hearts." Jake felt his face warm at the innocent compliment. When was the last time anyone had suggested he had a good heart? He'd spent so long protecting himself from emotional entanglements that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as someone capable of kindness. "Tell you what," Jake said, making a decision that surprised even him. You can stay here while you figure out your next move. But I've got conditions. Elena straightened, her expression becoming wary again. Jake could practically see her preparing for whatever demands he might make, steeling herself to protect her children if necessary. First condition, Jake continued, his voice taking on a mock-serious tone, is that all 4 of you have to behave yourselves. I run a quiet ranch here, and I won't tolerate any troublemakers. The triplets giggled at being included in the behavioral expectations, and even Elena's mouth quirked up in a tiny smile. Second condition, Jake went on, is that Pancho there has to earn his keep. I've got some areas around the ranch where the weeds are getting out of control. If he's going to eat my grass and drink my water, he might as well make himself useful. Pancho's tail wagged harder, as if he understood and approved of the arrangement. Third condition, Jake said, his voice becoming more serious, is that you let me help you figure out a real solution to getting to Colorado. I know this area, I know people, and I might be able to help you find options you haven't considered. Elena studied his face for a long moment, and Jake could see her trying to read his motivations. He didn't blame her for being cautious. A woman traveling alone with 3 children had to be careful about accepting help from strangers, no matter how harmless those strangers might appear. Why? She asked finally. Why would you help us? You don't know anything about us. It was a fair question, and Jake found himself struggling to find an answer that made sense even to himself. Why was he opening his home to a family of strangers? Why was he volunteering to get involved in their problems when he'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional complication? Maybe because I know what it's like to need a fresh start, he said finally. And maybe because those kids of yours deserve a chance to get where they're going safely. The honesty in his voice seemed to reach Elena, because some of the wariness left her expression. She looked at her children, who were watching the exchange with hopeful faces, then at Pancho, who was still resting his chin on Jake's chair with complete contentment. All right, she said finally. We accept your conditions, but I want to be clear that as soon as we can make other arrangements, we'll be out of your hair. Jake nodded, though something inside him was already dreading the thought of the house returning to its previous emptiness. Fair enough. In the meantime, let me show you where you can get settled. As Jake led the small family toward the guest rooms he hadn't used in years, he tried to convince himself that this was just a temporary inconvenience. A few days, maybe a week at most, and then his life would return to its comfortable, predictable routine. But watching Miguel's face light up when he saw the bookshelf in one of the guest rooms, and observing Sophia's careful way of testing the softness of the bed, and seeing how Carmen immediately went to the window to check that Pancho was still visible in the yard below, Jake had the unsettling feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And for the first time in years, that prospect didn't terrify him quite as much as it should have. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange blend of awkwardness and unexpected comfort. Elena insisted on helping with lunch preparation, moving around Jake's kitchen with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to making do with whatever was available. The triplets settled into their temporary quarters with the adaptability that seemed to be their superpower, while Pancho appointed himself ranch security and began a thorough patrol of the property. Jake found himself watching his guests with fascination, marveling at the way they functioned as a unit. Elena and the children communicated with a combination of Spanish and English, switching between languages so smoothly that Jake suspected they weren't even conscious of doing it. The triplets helped each other with small tasks, shared their belongings without being asked, and checked on each other's well-being with the kind of automatic care that spoke of children who'd learned to depend on each other. When the tow truck finally arrived just before sunset, Joe Hernandez took one look under the hood of Elena's station wagon and delivered the verdict Jake had been expecting. The engine was beyond economical repair, and the cost of fixing it would far exceed the value of the car. I can give you $200 for it as scrap, Joe offered, his weathered face sympathetic. I know it ain't much, but that's about all she's worth in this condition. Elena accepted the news with the stoic dignity Jake was beginning to recognize as her trademark response to setbacks. $200 wouldn't get her family to Colorado, wouldn't even get them back to wherever they'd come from. But she thanked Joe politely and signed over the title without complaint. After the tow truck disappeared down the dirt road, taking Elena's last link to her previous life with it, the small family stood in Jake's yard, looking suddenly more permanent. The reality of their situation was sinking in, and Jake could see Elena beginning to calculate just how limited her options had become. "Well," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "I guess we'll need to make some phone calls tomorrow. See if anyone we know can help us figure out what to do next." Jake had been thinking about their situation all afternoon, and he'd come to a decision that surprised even him. "Actually," he said, "I might have a better idea, but it would mean staying here a bit longer than just overnight." Elena looked at him with wariness creeping back into her expression. "What kind of idea?" "The kind that might solve problems for both of us," Jake replied. "But let's get some dinner first. We can talk about it afterward." Dinner was a revelation for Jake, who hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years. The triplets kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling stories about their travels and asking endless questions about ranch life. Elena contributed to the conversation while keeping a watchful eye on her children's behavior, ready to redirect them if they became too energetic or demanding. Pancho stationed himself strategically between the kitchen and dining area, accepting occasional scraps from the children while maintaining his dignity as the family's unofficial guardian. Jake found himself amazed by how naturally the goat had adapted to indoor life, never making a mess and seeming to understand the house rules without being taught. After dinner, while the triplets played quietly in the living room and Elena helped with the dishes despite Jake's protests, he finally broached the subject that had been on his mind all afternoon. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, choosing his words carefully. "And I realize I haven't been entirely honest about mine." Elena's hand stilled on the dish towel, and Jake could sense her immediate alertness. "The thing is," Jake continued, "I could use some help around here. This ranch is bigger than one person can really handle properly, and I've been letting things slide for too long." He gestured toward the window that looked out over his property. "I've got buildings that need maintenance, fences that need repair, gardens that could be productive if someone had the time to tend them properly. The truth is, I've been so focused on just getting by that I've forgotten what it means to really take care of a place." Elena dried her hands slowly, her green eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to read between the lines. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting a partnership," Jake said, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "You need time to figure out your next move and save some money for it. I need help bringing this place back to what it could be. Maybe we can help each other." Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his proposal. What would that look like exactly? Jake had been thinking about this all afternoon, trying to work out the details in his mind. "You and the kids would stay here, rent-free. I'd pay you a fair wage for helping with ranch work, and you could save up enough money to make a real fresh start somewhere, not just scrape by until the next crisis." "And what would I be doing to earn this wage?" Elena asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Whatever needs doing," Jake replied. "Cooking, cleaning, helping with repairs, tending a garden, maybe even helping with the books. I'm not talking about making you a servant. I'm talking about making you a partner in keeping this place running." Elena glanced toward the living room where her children were playing, their voices a soft murmur of contentment. Jake could see her mental calculations, weighing the risks and benefits of his proposal. "How long are we talking about?" she asked finally. "However long it takes," Jake said. "Could be a few months, could be longer. Depends on how much you want to save up and what kind of opportunity you're looking for." Elena was quiet for another long moment, and Jake found himself holding his breath while he waited for her answer. Somewhere during the course of this strange day, the thought of this family leaving had become genuinely distressing to him. The house felt more alive with their presence, more like a home than just a place where he happened to sleep. "The children would need to go to school," Elena said slowly. "Cedar Ridge has a good elementary school," Jake replied. "I could drive them back and forth, or we could look into getting you a vehicle once you've saved some money. And Pancho?" Jake glanced at the goat, who was lying contentedly by the fireplace like the world's largest, most unusual house dog. "Pancho can stay as long as he keeps earning his keep by eating weeds." Elena smiled at that, the first completely unguarded smile Jake had seen from her. It transformed her face, making her look younger and less burdened by whatever troubles had brought her to his doorstep. "You realize you're offering to take in a woman and 3 children you've known for less than 12 hours, she pointed out. "And a goat," Jake added solemnly. "Don't forget the goat who thinks he's a dog," Elena laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it delighted Jake. "And a goat who thinks he's a dog," she agreed. From the living room came the sound of the triplets' voices raised in excitement about something they'd discovered, followed by Pancho's unmistakable bleat of approval. The sounds of family life, Jake realized. The sounds that had been missing from his house for far too long. "All right," Elena said finally. "We'll stay, but I want to be clear about expectations on both sides. I work hard, I'm honest, and I expect to be treated with respect. My children are well behaved, but they're still children. They'll make noise, they'll ask questions, and they'll need guidance. And Pancho is part of our family. Where we go, he goes." Jake nodded seriously. "Understood. And my expectations are simple. Help me make this place better than it is now, and give me a chance to remember what it feels like to have people around who actually want to be here." The honesty in his voice seemed to reach Elena, because she extended her hand toward him. "Partners, then?" Jake shook her small, calloused hand, marveling at the strength in her grip. "Partners?" As they sealed their agreement, Jake heard Miguel's voice from the living room calling out in excitement. "Mama, come look! Pancho is showing Sofia how to play fetch, but he's using a sock instead of a stick." Elena and Jake exchanged amused glances and went to investigate, finding the triplets arranged in a circle on the floor while Pancho demonstrated his unique approach to the classic dog game. The goat would pick up one of Jake's socks in his mouth, carry it a few feet away, then bring it back and drop it at Sofia's feet, tail wagging the entire time. "He's teaching her how to be a good dog, too," Carmen explained seriously. "Pancho says if you're going to be part of a pack, you have to know how to play the right games." Jake stared at the scene, struck by the strange perfection of it. A few hours ago, his house had been silent and empty, a monument to solitude and self-protection. Now it was filled with laughter, conversation, and the oddly comforting presence of a goat who'd never met a boundary he recognized. As the evening wore on and the family settled into their first night at the ranch, Jake found himself lying awake in his own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people sleeping in his house. Soft breathing from the guest rooms, the occasional creak of someone turning over, even the gentle snoring that he was pretty sure was coming from Pancho, who'd apparently claimed the hallway as his nighttime post. For the first time in years, Jake fell asleep to sounds other than the desert wind and his own thoughts. And for the first time in even longer, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. The morning sun painted the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and amber as Jake Martinez stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, and surveyed a scene that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. Where once his ranch had been a testament to solitary efficiency, it now buzzed with the kind of organized chaos that only comes from a family settling into new rhythms. Elena was already in the vegetable garden she'd convinced him to let her plant, her auburn hair tied back with a bandana as she worked methodically through the rows of tomatoes and peppers that were thriving under her careful attention. The triplets were scattered across the yard in their morning routine. Miguel was helping repair a section of fence that had been sagging for months, his small hands surprisingly capable with the tools Jake had reluctantly allowed him to use. Sofia was reading under the cottonwood tree, one of the books from Jake's collection spread across her lap while she occasionally called out interesting facts to anyone within earshot. Carmen sat cross-legged in the dirt, sketching the desert landscape with the intense concentration of a true artist, Pancho lying contentedly beside her like the world's most unusual model. The goat had adapted to ranch life with an enthusiasm that continued to amaze Jake. True to his word, Pancho had proven himself an excellent weed control system, clearing out patches of invasive plants with the thoroughness of a professional landscaping crew. But more than that, he'd somehow appointed himself the ranch's unofficial supervisor, following Jake during his daily rounds and offering commentary in the form of bleats and tail wags that Jake had begun to interpret with surprising accuracy. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's car had broken down on the desert road, and Jake was forced to admit that his carefully ordered world had been transformed in ways he hadn't expected. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now filled daily with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the comfortable noise of people who belonged together. Elena had proven herself as capable and hard-working as she'd promised, tackling every task with a competence that made Jake wonder what her life had been like before she'd arrived at his gate. She'd never volunteered details about what had brought her and the children to his doorstep, and Jake had learned not to ask direct questions. But sometimes, late in the evening when the triplets were asleep and they sat on the porch sharing a cup of coffee, Elena would let slip small pieces of her story. A marriage that had ended badly. A husband who'd walked away from his responsibilities. A series of moves and fresh starts that had gradually worn down her resources until the broken-down station wagon represented her last hope of reaching Colorado and the job opportunity that had since evaporated. Jake found himself looking forward to these evening conversations more than he cared to admit. Elena was intelligent and well-read, with insights about everything from sustainable farming to child psychology that made him realize how much he'd missed having someone to talk to who could challenge his thinking. She was also beautiful in a way that seemed to become more apparent the more he got to know her, her inner strength and determination adding depth to features that were already pleasing to look at. But it was the way she interacted with her children that really captured Jake's attention. Elena was patient without being permissive, loving without being overprotective, and had somehow managed to raise 3 children who were genuinely pleasant to be around. The triplets had distinct personalities, despite their shared genetics. Miguel was the natural leader, always ready to take on new challenges and responsibilities. Sophia was the intellectual, constantly asking questions and absorbing information like a sponge. Carmen was the artist and empath, seeing details that others missed and responding to the emotional undercurrents in any situation. All 3 children had adapted to ranch life with an enthusiasm that reminded Jake of why he'd loved this place in the first place. They'd learned to help with daily chores, from feeding the chickens Jake had acquired specifically because Pancho seemed lonely without other animals around, to helping maintain the equipment that kept the ranch running. But more than that, they'd brought a sense of purpose to work that had become routine and meaningless during Jake's years of solitary existence. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke Jake's morning reverie. A dust cloud on the horizon announced a visitor, and Jake felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever the outside world intruded on their carefully established routine. In the weeks since Elena and the children had arrived, he'd had to deflect several curious inquiries from neighbors who'd heard rumors about his houseguests. Cedar Ridge was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the news that the reclusive Jake Martinez was suddenly hosting a family had generated considerable speculation. The vehicle that emerged from the dust cloud was a familiar red pickup truck belonging to Dr. Rebecca Santos, the local veterinarian who occasionally made house calls to check on Jake's livestock. Rebecca was one of the few people Jake had maintained any kind of relationship with during his years of self-imposed isolation, primarily because her professional services were necessary and her personality was refreshingly direct. Rebecca parked near the house and climbed out of her truck with the easy confidence of someone who'd been visiting the ranch for years. She was a woman in her early 40s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of competent manner that inspired trust in both animals and their owners. Her dark eyes took in the transformed scene around Jake's ranch with obvious interest and what looked like amusement. "Well, well," Rebecca said as she approached the porch, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "When I heard the rumors about you taking in a family, I figured I needed to see this for myself." Jake felt his defensive instincts kick in, the old urge to protect his privacy and avoid explanations. But before he could formulate a response, Elena appeared from the garden, wiping her hands on a towel as she walked toward them with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "You must be Dr. Santos," Elena said, extending her hand toward Rebecca. "Jake's mentioned you." "I'm Elena Vasquez." Rebecca shook Elena's hand while studying her with the kind of professional assessment she usually reserved for animals. "Rebecca Santos. And you're the mysterious family that has the whole town talking." Elena's smile was warm but guarded. "I hope we haven't caused any problems. We're just staying here temporarily while we figure out our next move." "Temporarily?" Rebecca repeated, glancing meaningfully at the flourishing garden, the repaired fence, and the obvious signs of long-term settlement. "Uh-huh." The triplets had noticed the visitor and were approaching with the cautious curiosity they'd learned to display around strangers. Pancho, meanwhile, had decided that Rebecca might be in need of his special brand of canine hospitality and was trotting toward her with tail wagging enthusiastically. "And this must be the famous goat I've been hearing about," Rebecca said, bending down to let Pancho sniff her hand. The goat immediately approved of whatever he discovered because his tail wagging intensified, and he settled into the classic sit position of a well-trained dog. "This is Pancho," Carmen said, her soft voice carrying a note of pride. "He thinks he's a dog, but he's really good at being one." Rebecca examined Pancho with professional interest, running her hands over his coat and checking his general condition with the automatic thoroughness of someone who'd spent decades caring for animals. "He's in excellent health," she announced. "Whatever you folks are doing, you're taking good care of him." "Elena makes sure he gets proper nutrition and exercise," Jake found himself saying. "She's got a real knack with animals." The comment earned him a surprised look from Elena, and Jake realized he'd spoken with more warmth and pride than he'd intended. Rebecca, meanwhile, was watching the interaction between them with the kind of knowing expression that made Jake distinctly uncomfortable. "So," Rebecca said, straightening up and addressing Jake directly, "I actually came by to check on that mare you were worried about last month. But I'm also curious about your new living arrangements." Jake felt his jaw tighten with familiar irritation. "My living arrangements are my business, Rebecca." "Of course they are," Rebecca agreed easily. "I'm just wondering if you've thought through all the implications of having a family living here." Elena's posture stiffened slightly, and Jake could sense her preparing for whatever judgment might be coming. The triplets moved closer together in the unconscious protective formation they adopted whenever they sensed adult tension. "What implications?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a warning edge. Rebecca looked around at the children, then back at Jake and Elena. "School registration, for one thing. If these kids are going to be here when school starts in a few weeks, they'll need to be properly enrolled. That means addresses, emergency contacts, all the official paperwork that makes them legal residents." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. In all his planning about how Elena and the children could help improve the ranch, he hadn't given much thought to the bureaucratic realities of their situation. The triplets would need to attend school, which meant official records and questions about their circumstances that might be complicated to answer. "We'll handle the school situation when the time comes," Elena said firmly. "We're not trying to avoid our responsibilities." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "I'm not suggesting you are. I'm just pointing out that if you're planning to stay in the area for any length of time, there are practical considerations that need to be addressed." She paused, studying Elena's face with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was seeing more than surface details. "You know, Cedar Ridge Elementary is always looking for volunteer help. If you have any background in education or childcare, they might be interested in talking to you about part-time work." Elena's eyes brightened with interest. "I was a teacher's aide before we started traveling. I loved working with children. I'll mention you to Principal Morrison," Rebecca said. "The pay isn't much, but it would give you a chance to get to know the community and help establish some local connections." Jake watched the exchange with mixed feelings. Part of him was grateful that Rebecca was offering Elena opportunities to build a life in Cedar Ridge. But another part of him was uncomfortable with the implications of Elena becoming more permanently established in the community. What had started as a temporary arrangement was beginning to feel increasingly permanent, and Jake wasn't sure how he felt about that. "Now," Rebecca said, turning back to Jake, "about that mare you were concerned about." The rest of Rebecca's visit passed in routine veterinary business, but Jake found himself distracted by the earlier conversation. As Rebecca examined his livestock and pronounced them all in good health, he kept glancing toward Elena and the children, wondering what their long-term presence in his life might mean. After Rebecca left, promising to speak to the school principal about Elena, Jake found himself alone with Elena in the kitchen, while the triplets played outside. The comfortable routine of preparing lunch together had become one of Jake's favorite parts of the day, a time when they could talk without the children's constant commentary and questions. "She seems nice," Elena said, slicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Santos, I mean." Jake nodded, still processing his conflicted feelings about the morning's conversation. "Rebecca's good people. Honest, direct, doesn't waste time on nonsense." "She's also worried about you," Elena observed quietly. Jake looked up sharply. "What makes you say that?" Elena's hands stilled on the cutting board, and she turned to face him directly. "The way she looked at you when she was talking about practical considerations. She's concerned that you're getting in over your head with us." The honesty in Elena's voice caught Jake off guard. He'd grown accustomed to their evening conversations, but this was the first time she'd addressed their situation so directly during daylight hours, when the reality of their arrangement couldn't be softened by darkness and shared solitude. "Are you," Elena continued, "getting in over your head, I mean?" Jake found himself studying Elena's face, taking in the intelligence in her green eyes and the slight tension around her mouth that suggested she was bracing herself for whatever his answer might be. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been willing to examine too closely. "I don't know," Jake said finally, the honesty surprising even him. "This wasn't what I planned when I opened that gate and let you folks in." Elena nodded slowly. "I know. And I want you to know that if this is becoming too complicated, if having us here is causing you problems, we can make other arrangements." The immediate surge of panic Jake felt at the suggestion told him more about his feelings than he was ready to acknowledge. "Is that what you want? To make other arrangements?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hands resuming their careful work with the vegetables. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for my children to have stability and security. For the first time in months, they're happy and settled. Miguel is sleeping through the night without nightmares. Sophia is reading at a level that amazes me. Carmen is creating art instead of just surviving from day to day." She paused, glancing toward the window where the triplets could be seen playing in the yard with Pancho. "But I also know that we've disrupted your life in ways you probably didn't anticipate. And I don't want to take advantage of your kindness." Jake felt something twist in his chest at the careful distance in Elena's voice. Somewhere over the past 3 weeks, he'd stopped thinking of her and the children as temporary house guests, and started thinking of them as, what? Family? The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. "Elena," he said, then stopped, unsure how to continue. She looked at him expectantly, and Jake found himself struggling to find words for feelings he'd been trying not to examine too closely. How could he explain that the house felt empty when she and the children weren't in it? That he looked forward to their evening conversations more than he'd looked forward to anything in years? That the sound of the triplets' laughter had become as essential to his daily routine as his morning coffee? "I like having you here," he said finally, the simple words carrying more weight than he'd intended. Elena's expression softened, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something warm and hopeful in her eyes. But then she looked away, her attention returning to the vegetables with renewed focus. "We like being here too," she said quietly. "But liking something and it being the right thing are two different matters." Before Jake could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Miguel bounded in, his face flushed with excitement and his clothes dusty from whatever project he'd been working on outside. "Jake," Miguel called, his voice carrying the enthusiasm that Jake had learned to associate with the boy's latest discovery. "Come see what Pancho figured out how to do." Jake and Elena exchanged glances, the serious conversation momentarily shelved in favor of whatever innovation Pancho had developed. They followed Miguel outside to find Sophia and Carmen standing near the chicken coop, watching Pancho with fascination. The goat had apparently learned to open the simple latch on the chicken coop gate, and was systematically herding the chickens out into the yard for their daily free-range time. But instead of the chaotic scramble that usually resulted when the chickens were let out, Pancho was managing the process with the efficiency of a professional sheepdog, gently guiding each chicken in the right direction and keeping them organized in a loose group. "He watched you do it every morning," Carmen explained, her voice filled with admiration for Pancho's problem-solving abilities, "and then he figured out how to do it himself. Now he thinks it's his job." Jake stared at the scene, amazed once again by the goat's uncanny ability to adapt and learn. "Well, I'll be damned." "Language," Elena said automatically, but there was amusement in her voice. "Sorry," Jake replied, not sounding particularly repentant. "But you have to admit, that's pretty remarkable." "Pancho's always been smart," Sophia said with the matter-of-fact pride of someone stating an obvious truth. "Mama says intelligence comes in all different forms, and just because someone doesn't think the same way you do, doesn't mean they're not thinking." Jake found himself looking at Elena with renewed respect. The wisdom behind Sophia's comment clearly came from her mother's teaching, and it spoke to a philosophy of acceptance and open-mindedness that Jake was still learning to embrace. The afternoon passed in the comfortable rhythm that had become their norm. Jake worked on repairs around the ranch while Elena tended her garden and managed the children's various projects. The triplets moved between helping with adult tasks and pursuing their own interests, always within sight and sound of the adults, but with enough independence to develop their own sense of competence and responsibility. It was during these ordinary moments that Jake found himself most aware of how much his life had changed. The ranch that had once been a refuge from human connection had become a place where connection flourished. The silence he'd once treasured had been replaced by the sounds of family life, and instead of feeling invaded, he felt complete. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner, Jake found himself studying each face around his table. Elena, focused and attentive as she helped Carmen cut her food while simultaneously listening to Miguel's enthusiastic recounting of his day. Sophia, quietly absorbing every detail of the adult conversation while pretending to concentrate on her meal. Carmen, sketching designs and the condensation on her water glass between bites. And Pancho, of course, stationed strategically between the kitchen and dining room, ready to provide cleanup assistance for any dropped food while maintaining his dignity as a proper family member. This was what he'd been missing, Jake realized. Not just companionship, but purpose. Not just conversation, but belonging. The ranch had always been his life's work, but Elena and the children had given it meaning beyond mere survival or financial success. After dinner, as had become their custom, Elena helped Jake with the dishes while the triplets played quietly in the living room. The evening light slanted through the kitchen windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the ordinary tasks feel almost ceremonial. "Jake," Elena said suddenly, her voice hesitant in a way that immediately got his attention. "Yeah?" Elena dried her hands on the dish towel, then turned to face him directly. "I need to tell you something. About why we were really traveling to Colorado." Jake felt his stomach tighten. During the weeks Elena and the children had been at the ranch, he'd constructed his own theories about their circumstances, but he'd never pressed for details. Now, faced with the prospect of learning the truth, he found himself both curious and apprehensive. "You don't owe me explanations," Jake said carefully. "Yes, I do," Elena replied firmly. "If we're going to stay here, if this is going to be more than just a temporary arrangement, then you deserve to know what you're getting involved with." Elena moved to the window, gazing out at the desert landscape that stretched toward the horizon. "The children's father left us 8 months ago. Just walked out one day while I was at work and the kids were at daycare. No note, no forwarding address, no explanation." Jake felt anger building in his chest at the image of someone abandoning Elena and the triplets, but he kept his voice carefully neutral. "I'm sorry," Elena continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "For a while I thought he might come back. I kept expecting him to realize what he'd given up and return to his family, but weeks turned into months, and it became clear that he was gone for good." She turned away from the window, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I tried to make it work, staying where we were, but everything reminded the children of their father, and I couldn't afford the rent on our apartment without his income. So I decided we needed a fresh start somewhere completely different." "Colorado," Jake said. Elena nodded. "I had a sister there who said she could help us get established, but when we were halfway there, she called to say her husband had lost his job and they couldn't take us in after all." Jake felt the pieces of Elena's story clicking into place. "So you were traveling with nowhere to go?" "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "I had about $300, a car that was falling apart, and 3 children who were depending on me to somehow make everything work out." The simple honesty in Elena's voice hit Jake harder than any dramatic confession could have. Here was a woman who'd faced the complete collapse of her carefully planned life and had somehow found the strength to keep going, to keep protecting her children, to keep believing that things would eventually work out. "What about now?" Jake asked quietly. "Do you still want to go to Colorado?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the window where the evening light was beginning to fade. "I don't know," she said finally. "When we first arrived here, I thought of this as just a temporary stop, a chance to regroup and figure out our next move." She paused, and Jake found himself holding his breath. "But the children are happy here," Elena continued. "Happier than they've been since their father left. And you've been," she struggled for words, "you've been incredibly kind to us. More than kind. Jake felt heat rising in his face. "It's been good for me too, having you all here." Elena turned to look at him directly, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his heart rate accelerate. "Has it? Really?" The question was loaded with implications that went beyond practical arrangements and temporary housing. Jake found himself stepping closer to Elena, drawn by something in her voice and the vulnerable way she was looking at him. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Before he could continue, the sound of running footsteps interrupted the moment. Miguel burst into the kitchen, his face bright with excitement. "Mama! Jake, come quick! Poncho's teaching the chickens how to play soccer." Elena and Jake stepped apart, the spell of the moment broken by Miguel's enthusiasm. But as they followed the boy outside to witness Poncho's latest innovation, Jake found himself acutely aware of Elena's presence beside him, of the way her shoulder occasionally brushed his arm, of the soft sound of her laughter as they watched the goat attempt to organize a game of soccer using a ball the children had left in the yard. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and Elena had retired to her room, Jake sat on his front porch and tried to make sense of the emotions churning inside him. The conversation in the kitchen had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of their situation. What had started as a practical arrangement was becoming something much more complicated and potentially much more meaningful. The truth was, Jake had been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's happiness, to find his own contentment tied to another person's well-being. Elena and the children had awakened feelings he'd thought were permanently buried, and now he was faced with the terrifying prospect of admitting that he didn't want them to leave. But wanting something and being ready for it were two different things, as Elena had pointed out earlier. Jake had spent years building walls around his heart, and dismantling them would require more courage than he was sure he possessed. As if sensing his thoughts, Poncho emerged from the house through the dog door Jake had installed specifically for the goat's convenience. The animal settled down beside Jake's chair with a contented sigh, his presence somehow comforting in the desert darkness. "What do you think, Poncho?" Jake asked quietly. "Am I making a mistake here?" Poncho looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, tail wagging slowly, as if to say that some questions could only be answered by taking risks. Jake scratched the goat's ears, marveling again at how this unusual animal had become such an integral part of their unlikely family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to figure out what he really wanted from this arrangement with Elena and the children. But tonight, sitting in the desert darkness with a goat who thought he was a dog, Jake allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he was brave enough to let his carefully guarded heart open one more time. 2 months later, Jake stood in the Cedar Ridge Elementary School auditorium, adjusting his tie nervously as he watched Elena help Miguel rehearse his lines for the Thanksgiving play. The boy was playing a turkey, complete with construction paper feathers that Carmen had painstakingly painted in brilliant autumn colors. Sophia had been cast as a narrator, her clear voice perfect for explaining the historical significance of the holiday to the audience of proud parents. The school had welcomed Elena with open arms when she'd volunteered to help with the production. Her background in education and natural way with children had quickly made her indispensable to Principal Morrison, who'd offered her a permanent position as a teacher's aide starting after the new year. Elena had accepted, her face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that came from finding meaningful work. Jake found himself watching Elena more than the children as she moved through the organized chaos of the rehearsal. She wore a simple green dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a way that showed off the graceful line of her neck. Somewhere over the past 2 months, Jake had stopped pretending that his feelings for Elena were merely those of a friend and employer. Poncho sat beside Jake in the auditorium, wearing a small pilgrim hat that Carmen had insisted would complete his costume as the unofficial mascot of the production. The goat tolerated the headwear with his usual dignity, though his tail wagged whenever one of the triplets looked his way. "Places, everyone?" called Mrs. Henderson, the drama teacher. The children scurried to their positions with the kind of excited energy that only came from weeks of preparation finally reaching fruition. Jake settled back to watch, but his attention kept drifting to Elena. She'd transformed his life completely, and he was finally ready to admit that he wanted her to stay permanently, not as an employee or temporary houseguest, but as his partner in every sense of the word. The performance was charming in the way that only elementary school productions could be, with forgotten lines covered by improvisation and costumes that had clearly been crafted with more enthusiasm than precision. Miguel delivered his turkey monologue with theatrical flair, Sophia narrated with confidence beyond her years, and Carmen provided artistic consultation for the backdrop changes between scenes. After the final curtain call, Jake waited while Elena helped clean up costumes and props. The triplets bounced around him, high on the excitement of their successful performance and the promise of the feast waiting at home. "Did you see us, Jake?" Sophia asked, her face flushed with triumph. "Did you see how I remembered all my lines?" "You were perfect," Jake assured her, meaning every word. "All three of you were absolutely perfect." Carmen tugged on his sleeve. Pancho was the best pilgrim hat wearer in the whole auditorium. Jake looked down at the goat, who was still wearing his ridiculous hat with patient resignation. He certainly was. As they walked to Jake's truck in the school parking lot, Elena fell into step beside him. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know school plays aren't exactly your usual entertainment." "Wouldn't have missed it," Jake replied, and realized he meant it completely. 6 months ago, he would have found excuses to avoid any community event. Now, watching Elena's children perform had felt like one of the most important evenings of his life. The drive home was filled with the triplets' excited chatter about their performance and plans for tomorrow's Thanksgiving dinner. Elena had insisted on cooking a traditional feast, despite Jake's protests that she didn't need to go to so much trouble. But she'd been planning the menu for weeks, involving the children in preparations that had turned the upcoming holiday into a celebration of their found family. At home, Jake helped Elena tuck the overexcited children into bed while Pancho made his evening rounds of the property. The ranch had settled into the kind of comfortable routine that felt like it had existed forever, even though Jake could clearly remember the silence that had filled these rooms just months before. "Elena," Jake said when they were finally alone on the front porch, sharing their customary evening coffee under the desert stars, "I need to tell you something." Elena looked at him with the kind of attention that had become familiar and dear to him over the months of their partnership. "What is it?" Jake had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times in his mind, but now that the moment had arrived, his carefully planned words deserted him. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart, with an honesty that surprised even him. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you, and I love Miguel, Sophia, and Carmen. I love Pancho, and the way he thinks he's a dog. I love the sound of your laughter in my kitchen, and the way the house feels when you're all in it." Elena's coffee cup stilled halfway to her lips, her green eyes wide with surprise. Jake continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "I know this wasn't part of our original arrangement. I know you came here looking for a temporary solution, and I offered you work, not complications. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about practical arrangements and started being about family." Elena set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "Jake, I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight," Jake said quickly. "I just needed you to know how I feel. How we all feel, really. Because this ranch has become home in a way it never was when I was here, alone." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the star-filled sky above them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but steady. "I love you too," she said, the words carrying across the desert stillness like a benediction. "I've been trying not to, because I was afraid of getting hurt again. Afraid of building something that might disappear. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just a job, or that you're just our employer." Jake felt his heart expand with a joy he'd forgotten was possible. "Elena." She turned to face him directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The children adore you. They've started calling you Papa Jake when they think I'm not listening. And Pancho follows you around like you're the most important person in his world." Jake laughed, the sound mixing relief and happiness. "Pancho's got good judgment for a goat who thinks he's a dog." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant happiness. "So what happens now?" Jake stood up from his chair and moved to kneel beside Elena's rocking chair, taking her hands in his. "Now I ask you properly. Elena Vasquez, will you marry me? Will you let me be a real father to Miguel, Sophia, and Carmen? Will you help me turn this ranch into the kind of home our family deserves?" Elena's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises, and the kind of love that builds slowly but lasts forever. When they finally broke apart, Both were laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," Elena said firmly. "Yes to all of it." From inside the house came the sound of hurried footsteps and excited whispers. The triplets appeared at the window, their faces pressed against the glass as they watched the adult drama unfolding on the porch. "Did she say yes?" Miguel called through the window. "We couldn't help but listen," Sophia added apologetically. Carmen simply pressed her hand against the glass in a gesture of pure joy. Jake and Elena looked at each other and burst into laughter. "I guess our engagement has been officially approved," Elena said. "By the most important judges," Jake agreed, waving the children outside to join the celebration. The triplets tumbled onto the porch in their pajamas, followed by Pancho, who seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. They gathered around Jake and Elena, chattering excitedly about wedding plans and whether they could help with the ceremony. As Jake held Elena close while the children planned their future around them, he marveled at how completely his world had changed. The woman who'd appeared at his gate with 3 children and a goat in a broken-down car had brought him everything he'd never known he was missing. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning, Jake Martinez married Elena Vasquez in a simple ceremony in their own backyard. Miguel, Sophia, and Carmen served as the wedding party, while Pancho wore a bow tie and carried the rings in a small basket attached to his collar. The goat performed his duties with the dignity befitting his role as the family member who'd made it all possible by being exactly who he was. As Jake kissed his new wife under the cottonwood tree where Carmen had first sketched the desert landscape, he understood finally what home really meant. It wasn't the land or the buildings or the carefully maintained solitude he'd once treasured. Home was Elena's laughter, the triplets' voices calling him Papa Jake, and yes, even Pancho's enthusiastic tail wagging as he supervised every aspect of their celebration. The ranch that had once been a refuge from love had become love's perfect expression, and Jake Martinez had never been happier to be wrong about what he needed to be complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.